I'm working on a book on disability. I've written a handful of articles along the way, and what I want to do today is give you some of how I'm trying to figure out how that book is going to start. Nothing about us without us. What a long fight it's been for this phrase to become meaningful in our churches and secular political communities. It's been an important fight in which many disability activists have done themselves proud. Too long we've talked about rather than listened to the voices of people with disabilities. It's a great thing to have shifted the burden of proof against anyone who wants to talk about disability without listening closely to the voices of those among us who bear the label disabled. Two movements have played central parts in establishing this new moral onus. And we can call those, broadly speaking, liberation theologies of disability and the politically allied but conceptually very different approach of those involved in advocacy group politics. One of the founding documents of disability theology, Nancy Iceland's Disabled God, advanced a liberative theology of disability that's deeply shaped the substantive development of the field. She rightly insisted that if we, and here I'm speaking as a Christian, are to foster more just societies, we must attend to the ways we talk about God, and specifically, how our descriptions of God can be disempowering and degrading to people with disabilities. A church that wants to work for a better world for disabled people will indeed need to expand its ways of talking about God. Famously, Iceland's own approach to this task was to picture God in a sit-puff wheelchair. Advocacy group politics is widespread in Western liberal societies, and it doesn't need much introduction. This model understands the fight for justice for disabled people to be very like those of other politically excluded minority groups. Their aim is to band together to fight for their rights and make their voices heard in order to change public policy. On my reading, liberative and activist approaches have come to dominate the discourse of disability theology. So my intention today is to suggest that it might be time to think about a new direction, or rather to think again about why it might be worth trying an old direction once again. I do so not as a repudiation of these other two traditions, but precisely in order to take an important class of disabilities seriously that simply doesn't fit easily within either of these two theories, and that is intellectual disability. The premise of the slogan, "Nothing about us without us," is that we will achieve justice for the disabled people if we let them speak, if only we include them in our collective decisions about how our religious and political communities should be configured. In a recent book, The Capacity Contract, Intellectual Disability and the Question of Citizenship, Stacy Simplican critically analyzes the limits of this premise. Once we have assumed a picture of politics as rational public debate, it immediately follows that those who can't talk well won't be able to engage in setting the terms of the legal structures that govern secular society. So I think Simplican is right to draw attention to the significant limits of advocacy politics by speaking about justice for people with learning difficulties. And I'm extending that criticism to liberation theologies, which typically exclude intellectual disability from the analysis, as Iceland explicitly does. So that's the first sort of methodological complication I want to deal with today. And you're going to have to forgive me for pointing out one more nest of theoretical tangles that face disability theology today, in my view. My aim in doing so is to clarify why I think we need to move a big step forward, methodologically speaking. The first is the complex problem of introducing autobiography into academic discourse. We all know how powerful it is to start to talk about experiences of disability in public. And of course, it was a very powerful evening we had last evening. So I hope to burn up a little of your intellectual energy this morning by making you do the intellectual work that didn't really get done last night. So we need the stories, but we also need the conceptual analysis. And because it's so powerful to tell stories, my sense is that sometimes it can become too powerful. Is it really possible to have a critical and intellectually free conversation with someone who's just told a story about their life or their suffering? Stories do, of course, a lot of good work in drawing people in, engaging people so they can really hear what we want to say. But they can also insulate the storyteller as beyond intellectual criticism. It therefore seems to be a methodologically significant problem that the convention has developed in disability theology that an author needs to begin with a story, or at least hint at having a relevant experience in order to establish their credentials as part of the in-group. We have to prove that we are recipients of the oppressive structures of mainstream society rather than outsiders looking in and talking about disability without us. That is, without consulting people with disabilities. This is why it seems to me we're in a sticky situation in the discipline today. We're expected to tell biographical stories to get our intellectual work going, but those stories are understood as credentialing gestures in the terms of either liberative theology or minority group advocacy. And I think the first thing that probably should be said about this situation is that it probably excludes some useful insights of people who think they don't have access or can't tell such first-person stories. And let me reassure you as I say that I'm definitely not encouraging the armchair punditry about disability that I'm quite sure all of us have heard more than enough of. The more pressing problem, in my view, is intellectual stagnation. Most Americans are going to get me when I observe that you can get yourself into some terribly hot water by being rigidly committed to a strictly two-party system. The same is true. The same is true of a discipline that makes it difficult to talk about disability without joining either the Liberation Theology Party or the Minority Advocacy Party. So let me just say flat out that I'm really neither of those. I'm, of course, extremely appreciative of what both have accomplished, but I want more. I want to go further. And to do that, I think we have to ask harder questions than the very important "nothing without us" slogan allows us to ask. So I'm going to develop my thoughts this morning on the theme in four broad movements. First, I'll develop my description of the paradoxes of representing others, especially those who cannot speak. I'll then try to complicate, or as my guru said, complexify some of the hard divisions we often assume to lie between me and my story and other people. A third section will present the act of writing and speaking about disability as a way of coming to terms with living as a vulnerable creature. And in a brief concluding section, I'll suggest how we might honestly face the reality that we can never really escape the difficult labor of representing others. So now to my first section, witness and the paradoxes of representation. Though I'm very nervous about it for all the reasons I've just outlined, I'll now take the plunge. I want to go beyond the two dominant frameworks in our discipline today because I'm the father of Adam, who's 13. And part of the reason I don't tell stories is I find it difficult to tell stories. I don't expect him to ever divert myself for a second and say that I really enjoyed having Lisa Joy up last night, who I think is probably about as talkative as Adam will ever be. I certainly don't expect him to utter a complete sentence. So if Adam's ever going to be a political subject in the terms of the minority group model, somebody's going to have to speak for him. Is that supposed to be me? If I speak, how is that not a violation of nothing without us? From the perspective of liberation theology, the problem is, can it really do justice to human lives that are cognitively and verbally quite limited? Do we really need to go down the road of saying that if we want to take Adam's life seriously as valuable, we need a God who has Down syndrome, can't really speak, and might well be going blind? How, in short, can I speak about Adam in a manner that short-circuits the conventions of the discipline? that puts him into him and the other non-speakers at the margins of theory. I firmly believe that people like Adam deserve not to be outliers in disability theology. The question then is how to talk responsibly about someone like Adam who can't speak for himself, or how to speak about him without becoming entangled in the dynamics of the discipline that I've just outlined. So that's the methodological problem as I think we're facing in the discipline today. But to admit it to the discussion opens a host of new problems, beginning with this one. How do I talk about Adam without simply co-opting him into my own story? As we know, it's terrifyingly easy to put our words into the mouths of those who can't speak for themselves. Does that mean I shouldn't speak about Adam, since I'll almost inevitably present him in ways that flatter me? Perhaps there's someone more qualified who knows him better, and I'm going to nominate his mom, Stephanie. But I'm pretty sure she's also capable of telling his story in a way that serves her interests as well. So we end up with a paradox. Those who know Adam most intimately seem to be ruled out as his spokesperson, and he lives in a society where the capacity to speak has come to be very, very close to the one capacity you need to be taken seriously as a citizen and a church member. In light of this paradox, what I want to do for the remainder of my time is to tell a story, and it's not Adam's story, but my own. I want to ruminate on the story of my struggles to bring Adam's life to words. My story, it will turn out, includes Adam. It includes being an academic, and it includes being a father as an academic. It also includes being a Christian, which means it entails being in a relationship with a person who knows both me and Adam better than we know ourselves. I hope that in so doing, I will lead us at least one step beyond the impasses that currently constrain disability theology. So let me begin with a bold claim. Writing our lives or speaking our lives is one way of living them. Put more precisely, if I as an author enter a cultural domain, the domain of the academic paper or the conference, which is one of many in which people with disabilities, especially the learning impaired, are excluded and in practice demeaned, how am I not perpetuating the very exclusions of some human beings from life together that I wholeheartedly wish to overturn? I'm writing, of course, as one who's been profoundly challenged, who's become a different sort of Christian and theologian by someone most would consider profoundly intellectually disabled. Part of Adam's challenge to me is that he'd made me uncomfortable with that way of describing our relationship. He reveals to me the flimsiness of the easy binary we all too often rely upon between the able and disabled, between high functioning and low functioning, between profound and high functioning. He also challenges me to let you, my audience, appreciate him as a person, as a citizen, and as a churchman in his own right. This has two crucial implications. First, I'm trying hard to resist what Stacy Simplican nicely calls, quote, the adverse effect of depoliticizing disability by continually cloaking it within a familial framework. Loving Adam may be a good place to start to talk about disability, but it may also sanitize his challenge to all of you by hiding the fact that I want you also to be challenged by his predicament as a citizen of a developed democratic society and as a member of the church that we know as we know it today. I want you to think about his life on its own terms and in a way that puts me as a storyteller as much as possible in the background. Second, I want you to be aware that simply by speaking, by telling stories at all, we may be obscuring important aspects of lives like his. I'm really not sure, for instance, that Adam's experience of the world has a narrative structure with a past, future, and present. He appears to inhabit the world in something like a perpetual present tense. I'm trying to complicate then from the outset any suggestion that when I tell a story about Adam, which of course a story has a past, present, and future, the whole horizon of narrative depends on it. So story, the term story itself, complicates any suggestion that when I'm talking about Adam, we'll ever be able to adjudicate whether that is accurate or not. Does my perception, that as I narrate it, map onto his perception of our shared experiences? It's simply difficult to put his life and our life together into words. And I don't want to obscure or evade these difficulties in the course of talking about him and about disability. Rather, I want to take the opposite road, which is to dramatize these difficulties, make them more tangible. In truth, this is a problem we face every time we narrate events in which more than one person is involved. My wife Stephanie and our other children their grandparents are here today. So our other kids, Caleb and Agnes, they've lived through all sorts of the events I might tell about Adam. And their stories would be subtly, but importantly different from the ones I'm going to tell. And I have no evidence that Adam cares whether his story is told or not. So why then tell it? I tell Adam's story as a witness of his witness. I'm not telling his story, or I wouldn't tell his story because it establishes my authority to speak. But vicariously to point toward that which I have come to believe he embodies, the sheer beauty of his own form of life. I suffer the labor of finding ways to let you hear his voice because I've heard it. And I believe I've heard Adam articulating profound things with wide-ranging implications, despite the reality that his is a still, small voice with no powers of projection. But he is a healer in a church founded to be a hospital for fallen humanity. Part 2, complexifying the word I, Kafka and Augustine. In my struggle not to evade the difficulties of witnessing to Adam's witness, I've found the example of the Czech novelist Franz Kafka illuminating. Kafka too wrote his life. As a Jew living in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as a functionary in a large insurance agency reaching a new pinnacle of bureaucratic complexity, as an unmarried first son of an overbearing and socially aspirant father seeking family advantage through his marriage, and then as a man of soldiering age kept home from the gruesome trenches of the First World War, he came increasingly to realize that without finding a way to articulate the tensions and dilemmas of his existence, he would not be able to preserve his integrity as a person. He would be psychologically dismembered by the forces at work in and upon him. We learned from his diaries and letters that he became increasingly aware that his writing of stories and then novels was his way of coming to terms with his own life. Writing was a work of mental and emotional processing, and a technique for examining and reforming his hopes and so his self-identification. Writing, he believed, was a transformative activity because it was, quote, a search for a description in which every word would be linked to my life, which I could draw to my heart, and which would transport me out of myself. The first thing that's interesting about Kafka's writing for our purposes is how different it is from the forms of self-presentation that have become ubiquitous in our social media saturated present. He wasn't trying to tell others that his life was more interesting than it actually was, but instead he was wrestling like Jacob with the angel, with its most problematic and conflicted aspects. It was a risky strategy, this work of exposing his most precious fears, hopes, and regrets in the digested form of fictional tales. He was not quite writing about his life, even though all he wrote clearly sprung directly out of that life. It's probably best to describe this as writing as resistance, writing aiming to discover a way of living with integrity within the concrete contours of his particular context. He was looking for an invisible coherence of his own narrative by constructing worlds for fictional characters who were themselves sufferers and resistors to inhumane forces. He relied on these fictional characters to somehow, through hints and gestures, uncover new and more promising ways of living to an author who was himself also a sufferer and resistor. In at least one important respect, the 4th century African Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo can be said to be much closer to Kafka than to contemporary habits, than to contemporary habits of self-presentation. He didn't, like Kafka, offer fictionally disguised versions of his life to the reading public, but his own life. His autobiographical Confessions was so compellingly readable that it became one of the most formative books shaping the Western canon for centuries to come. And in part, that was because as he wrote his life, he didn't try to hide from his flaws. And he tells some pretty unflattering stories about himself. He wrote primarily to witness to the work of the God who had claimed him out of his self-absorbed superficiality. His central focus, as he tells his own story, is to present his life as a worked example of his confession that Jesus Christ is still at work even today and can and should be called out to and listened for. This firm belief gave definition to all he thought about himself. He thus wrote as an address to God, as a prayer to which he invited others to listen. In the Reformation period, Martin Luther again struck a very similar authorial pose, inspired by Augustine's example. Like Augustine, Luther insisted that it was impossible to think the idea God without entering into a conversation with God. With this move, he resisted any drifting of theological language away from context and biography, since all converse is necessarily in one's own voice. We can draw this in contrast with John Calvin, for example, who wrote in what was in the tradition before and has what become the dominant theological voice in mainstream theology today. That is, his theological treatises and biblical commentaries are rigorously screening out any reference to his own life and his converse with God. What I'm suggesting here is that there is a long and in our circles underappreciated theological tradition in which it's assumed that theological language gains potency when we understand how an author believes it hits the ground. The doctrinal claims become tangible when we're told what an author thinks they commit us to, how they understand them to comport us to the world in which we live. So what's so memorable about the stance Augustine strikes in the Confessions is that he doesn't make absolute statements about God, but he calls on God. The utterance, "You are Lord," or "praise you for your omnipotence," like what we did just a few minutes ago, certainly have conceptual entailments that we need to think hard about. But what the challenge from Augustine and Luther, as I'm presenting one, is a fertile one, to make sure that the sort of work that I'm doing now, which is really conceptual work, never drifts free from the theological claims that we believe, as well as the relational intimacy that keeps it in this world. What Luther called the pro-meity, or the for-me aspect of the Christian confession. So I could summarize this with a line from Luther that he often said that even the devil can say the creed, but what the devil resists is that Christ died for me. So with the foregoing in mind, we'll better understand that when Augustine utters the word I, he's consciously performing a gesture that's far more theologically complex than we might at first assume. Augustine wants his act of pointing to himself be disciplined by very specific theologically configured parameters. Thus, as Jeffrey Rees has observed, Augustine's search for God is self-interested in the sense that he finds his own self a source of intense theological interest as a knowing person who is comprehensively known by God. Notice then how Augustine's I diverges from the modern secular self. We moderns, including we Christians, are used to understanding ourselves to be largely self-contained and self-determining. Augustine confesses that the wholeness of his life can only be one that he has been given and must actively work to receive. He's a person, first, who's been claimed by Jesus Christ, and because he has, second, he's now forced to come to terms with Scripture and the Christian community. So these objective and external claims form the matrix within which he must reconsider the narrative coherence of the various elements of his life. In confessing himself to be a Christian, then, Augustine sees that he has been set on a path toward the discovery of his true I, the one constituted within a set of relationships that precede him with God, creation, and the neighbor. This means he's been set against himself. From that decentered position, he must ask anew what he can actually say about himself, having renounced the attempt to try to narrate his existence in abstraction from the Christian witness and his creaturely neighbors. So these are all entailments of his realization that his whole identity turns on how he will narrate his own origin in the God who has created him and claimed him for life with the people of God. Augustine, therefore, comes to realize, and this is really the main theme of the Confessions, that he's going to have to tell three stories all at one time. First, he has to let his readers know about the peculiarities of his own unique life. This is who I am in all my contingent particularity. Second, as a Christian convert, his story necessarily includes having been captured against his will for the plans and programs of the Lord of history. His second confession is therefore witnessing to having seen the action of Jesus Christ afoot in world affairs. That this co-option of his life plans is rightly called a capture implicates a final aspect of his confession. He has to tell the story of being rescued from his own sins. He has to explain how he was rescued from the selfishness that had once blinded him to the truth of God's gracious love. As complex as the task might be, he realizes that all three confessions must be undertaken at once if he's to come to grips with his story as one he now knows to be enfolded within the greater story of God's ways with the world. With these observations in place, we're now much better situated to introduce the approach I'm commending. So when I say I, the person who's speaking is also the father of Adam, whose characteristically round face and vaguely Asiatic eyes make him instantly recognizable to most as a bearer of the medical label Down syndrome. Fewer will recognize his lack of speech and characteristic flapping arm gestures as signs of his autism. Adam's now a teenager, a fact that I cannot contemplate with genuine wonder. Augustine found it impossible to narrate his own life without returning to ponder what God had been up to through his complex relationship with his pre-Christian mistress, who goes unnamed in the Confessions, and the son he named Adeodatus, gift of God. So too, I can't imagine talking about health and disability, Christ the healer, Christian theology, or myself in any serious way without reference to Adam. Okay, part 3. Writing disability as coming to terms with creaturely vulnerability, which I assure you I'm feeling acutely. Augustine said of his faithful Christian mother, Monica, upon her death, quote, "My soul was wounded, and my life, as it were, was torn to pieces, since my life and hers had become a single thing." If I were to speak and write as an academic, as if Adam and his Creator were not definitive factors organizing my sense of what I'm saying when I utter the word I, especially were I to write about disability, you would be very welcome to accuse me of tacitly supporting the very cultural trajectories that attempt to ignore and hide away lives like his. And I do know very well-known theologians who've done theology without revealing that they have children like Adam. I thus take my task as an author and an academic not only to disavow speaking as if I haven't been drastically changed by Adam, but also to unhand the temptation to use the life of the mind and my academic training to protect myself from the vulnerability entailed in so speaking. I am in part trying to follow the lead of Jean Vanier, who pointedly used only the given names of core members at L'Arche as an enacted label warning against the danger of labeling people according to their medical or psychological diagnoses. In so doing, he presses us to ponder the difference between thinking about disability or disabled people and asking what is actually entailed in being in communion with a person whose personhood seems so different from mine, but which is so natural for them. He thus forces us and to wrestle practically with the paradoxical and naive center and periphery schemas we use to distinguish ourselves from them. My overall aim in proposing this new direction is to suggest that what it might look like for me publicly to explore my life with Adam as a sort of worked and conscious attempt to give up such conceptualizations by opening myself and, I hope, you to the wonder at the heart of this creaturely life we live. My suggestion is then that the text before me and the words you're hearing now are traces of my life with God and with Adam. More precisely, in its account of my struggle to receive a person entrusted to me within the world in which we both must live, the industrialized, consumerist, secular West, often designated with the label political liberalism. It's from this vantage point that I feel my affinity with Kafka's sense that in the form of art he could simultaneously come to terms with both himself and his world without any interruptive attempt to tear these two aspects apart for analysis. His awareness that all such dissections can only destroy living things committed him to pursuing an intertwined work of self-criticism and social criticism. So what I'm proposing is a disability theology freed to interlace biographical vignettes where these seem necessary to advance an inquiry, while at the same time being fully aware that anything we might say about disability is in a crucial sense simply digested and even anonymized commentary on the tensions of the world we moderns inhabit, meaning you and I and people with all sorts of impairments, and what we might hope for, what we might dare hope for all of us amidst it. So I'm writing, just like Kafka, in order to digest events that have left an unsettled and finely textured sediment in my soul. Though such work might tell stories, it should be sharply distinguished from autobiography, even when it clearly makes autobiographical references. Here I take Kafka's approach to be suggestive for another reason. He didn't take statistics, political pressure groups, or moral arguments as his analytical starting points, but gazes and gestures. These he believed to be the most revealing indicators of the truth of specific times, places, and relationships. To take one example, as a man of fighting age kept home from the front by his role as a war-indispensable insurance company employee, he acutely felt the barrage of disapproving gazes trained on him by the citizens of Prague, which communicated subtly and at times overtly their condemnation for his not being at the war front. There are only passing complaints in his papers about the disastrous public policies of his government, the rampant nationalism of the time, or the crushing economic hardship everyone was experiencing. And yet the war did directly impact all that he thought and felt. He experienced it as a personal attack at the emotional level, an attack prosecuted against him by way of sneers and glares. This led him deeply to ponder how the weight of a gaze lingers long after the act of gazing has passed, how approval and disapproval burrow into the soul of those looked upon. The reality of people's inner worlds revealed in such gazes and interpersonal relationships is thus internalized. It surveils us, which is why surveillance technologies and the experience of social opprobrium so powerfully shape how we inhabit in the world. If I have any right to write about disability, it's because I too have been disabled by gazes. Did I really just claim to be disabled? What does it actually mean for someone to make such a bold claim whose body and mind locate him right at the center of the Western ideal form of humanity? As a white male, healthy, articulate, and in the prime of life? It means first to have been rendered constantly sensitive to slights, glares, and curiosity of the general public. This is a passive operation, one that just happens to you. As the bodies of the impaired can experience being abled by intimate and supportive relations with others, and here I'm thinking of Nancy Iceland's comment about her allies being her hands and feet, and that is something that could sort of lift her, so too can others' largely social disablement come to be lived as our own. This new sensitivity comes to life in internalized postures steeled to negotiate and weather the field of gazes that constitute public space. This heightened sensitivity is typically discovered by noticing oneself wincing or assuming a defensive crouch at the passive stares of the curious, or conveying with a glance a surprising sense of kinship or affection with someone in a wheelchair, or with an autistic teen and her harried loved one. Above all, to have been disabled in this manner means having become aware of what it means that some human beings are never invisible in a crowd. Consider how powerfully and tersely a narrative of gesture and gaze can situate words. And here I'm trying to display that our words live in an environment, and that environment can be picked up by looking at gestures and gazes. Adam is sitting in a chair at a public place, at a pool, self-absorbed, and a small boy stealthily approaches, exchanging conspiratorial looks with two other little boys who are shyly following. And the boy comes to him, his finger is outstretched, and he's going to poke the funny boy. When confronted, a furious blush and a scurrying escape. His mother, imperious, confrontational, the boys clinging to her leg, soon beginning to cry, first whimpering, then violently. The climax, the maternal righteous indignation and a raised voice. How do you know what my boy was thinking? The child with the tear-stained face, still contorted with tears. I'm sorry. A little child shall lead them. Such a disabling is thus, and second, a direct invitation to become an engaged observer of the systematic ways in which our world disadvantages and slights some, the least able to defend themselves, while making life as easy as possible for others, the most able. To see so tangibly the long-standing dismissive marginalization of whole groups of people is, frankly, enraging, or it should be enraging. We have to attempt to channel and discipline that rage into a range of discussions about how we might go on with any integrity in a society that condemns some to die because they can't speak or because their lives are considered too divergent from our pictures of the good life. This second movement, then, is a much more active work of processing, analyzing, and response to what these new sensitivities have revealed about the world we live in. When I say then that Adam disabled me, I'm saying that he has drawn me into his world with its time and its politics. Were he to die, he would live on in me, in my way of being in and perceiving our contemporary world. And so loving him has slowly birthed in me, or at least accelerated in me, the highly countercultural view that it's outrageous that not so long ago people like him were routinely hidden away. offer no education or a place in their own family. And that even to this day, the vast majority of people like him are simply killed rather than granted a place in modern Western democracies. So I've been disabled because Adam rubs my face in the barbarism of our civilized world. I raise my voice to expose and demolish the configuration of words and ideas that make that barbarism seem reasonable. So behind every word that I'm saying is a wall of gazes, not gazes on its author, me, but toward the one he gazes at in love. A gaze itself provoked and consoled by the gaze of the one who created us both, as we are. So I write and I speak in response first to averted gazes, confused and repulsed gazes, mocking and annoying gazes, as well as, and more powerfully, by gazes and gestures of joy and delight. We must reach to find words for both our angry protest at certain gazes and gestures, as well as the unexpected joy and comfort that beams from faces suffused with love. The anger cannot and must not be an end in itself. And here the conditional is emphatic, the anger at the way our world is arranged and our world that burns through disability theology is theologically defensible, it can only be as a lament and protest that we so habitually disdain God's good gifts. And that really is worth protesting. Because Adam doesn't speak, to know him as God's gift is to have been taught the importance of being attuned to his gesture and gaze, his only means of communication. Were we not to attune ourselves to his gaze and gesture, we would do great violence to him. Having been so attuned, the blundering, blind violence of our age, cloaked in obscuring words, becomes all too vividly visible. There are several important senses in which beginning from my life with Adam overdetermines, of course, my interest in cognitive disability, and more specifically, the question of relatively severe mental impairment. This is my sort of outrider caveat. This focus generates the demand that I deal sensitively with entirely appropriate demands of disability activists that they get to speak for themselves. And as I hinted when I introduced Adam, not every disability is visible, or at least visible to the untrained eye. So we'll also need to be aware as we proceed in the way I'm suggesting of this other important boundary between the person whose disability is written in an obviously legible way on their body and those whose inner pains, compulsions, and mental impairments much more subtly and intermittently reveal themselves. This brings us to our last point, the inescapable labor of representation. Disability theology must not evade the human side of living with disability, how one goes on in the gloriously repetitive stuff of the day-to-day. And we're not going to get there without telling stories. Some glimpses have to be offered. Augustine's first part of the story, first part of his confession, he has to tell us what going on actually looks like in his place and time, in all its joy and difficulty. Going on happens in a social context. In Adam's case, weaved in with the lives of his family, his school, his local and national governments, as well as his church. This means telling other people's stories too, further complexifying the difficulties of representation. When I speak about my own difficulties in living day in and day out with someone who's genuinely different from me, I'm in fact pointing to all these people and social orders, the frictions between them, and the mediating role that people have to play who live with Adam and try to help him negotiate a world that's not set up for him. To conclude, for all these reasons, the problem of representation is simply inescapable. How do I speak about Adam without robbing him of his own nonverbal voice or putting words in his mouth? How do I speak about family life without doing the same to my wife, Stephanie, who has her own views and experiences of many of the events we have lived together with Adam? Difficult problems associated with gender also peek out here. It makes a difference that I'm a man and Adam is a boy. If he were a girl and I was a woman, some very different dynamics would enter the scene. The same is true of questions of race. All I can do in response to these limitations is to admit that I feel a vocational responsibility to write about what I've understood Adam to reveal about God and our world, and that I therefore can't do anything else than write in my own voice. But if I write well, I hope that I can allow the limits of my own voice and perception to appear, not only in relation to Adam, but in relation to other people with disabilities, as well as the women and people of other social groupings whose experiences clearly differ from my own. My hope is to provoke you to consider again what it means to live as limited creatures, vulnerable and imperfect. I hope we can find a way around the us-them dynamics that are built into advocacy politics that inevitably will locate me as a representative of the oppressor class. There's a fear of exposing oneself to that sort of almost inevitable suspicion that stifles real intellectual engagement about disability. But Christians aren't called to live by fear. When I dare, as the limited creature that I am, to tell stories of Adam's witness, I do so in the hope of dispelling various layers of silence that surround disability in churches, in public discussion of social care policy, and in medical context. These overlapping zones of silence are the seedbed of the fear that disability and what we think of as imperfection are dark thunderclouds heralding our expulsion from the good life into a life of grinding difficulties and unbearable expense. None of us easily escapes the sensation that the term disability, at the very least, promises an unbearable diminishment of the life choices available to us. But the desire to eliminate people who we believe can't live up to our standards of perfection renders our lives and our societies frightfully two-dimensional, efficient and unsurprising. This is why, as Nancy Eastland once observed, quote, ignoring disability means ignoring life. It's the precursor to isolation and powerlessness. My quest, then, is for a vision of the Christian gospel that allows us to risk living as the vulnerable creatures we in fact are, to come to terms with our limits and blemishes, and to delight in the unexpected. What Christians should hear in the term disability is the rumble of something approaching that's much bigger than us, and which forces from us an enlarged capacity to love, wonder, and praise. Thank you.